Hello, everyone. I'm Joe Yonan, and I am very excited to be here with Bryant Terry, who is chef, author, food justice advocate, activist, gardener, father, husband. You can stop me at any time. Bryant's work is something that I've appreciated for many years, so I'm excited to talk to him today. And we're talking about sustainability and sustainable food systems. And I thought I would first, really, Bryant, just ask you for your definition of a sustainable food system. What is that? What does it actually entail?
Joe, when I hear that question, my mind immediately goes to what I argue should be the primary function of a sustainable food system, and that's feeding people, feeding everyone. And we know that we produce enough food globally to feed about 10 billion people. So theoretically, there shouldn't be any hunger or food insecurity. But as you know, there are nearly 800 million people who suffer from hunger and food insecurity. And I think it's important that we determine, what are the deficiencies and gaps in our food system that's creating this reality and really working to correct them. Um, you know, Once again, this may not come as a surprise to you, Joe, but it's really heartbreaking to me that the people who are most impacted by hunger and food security are the people who are actually growing our food. The Food and Agriculture Organization tells us that 80% of the world's chronically hungry are actually farmers. If we were to just look at what's happening domestically, I will offer two things. One, the subsidies that are often going to big ag and that ensure that they can produce. When we think about the food that's actually contributing to the decline in public health in the United States, these are mostly foods that come from the big ag that's subsidized, and they're able to produce foods that are artificially cheap. So the food that are high in fat, high in salt, high in sugar, low in the desirable nutrients that we all need. So what if we reverse that? What if we ensure that the mid and small size farmers who are growing food with integrity, who are growing it with an eye on sustainability, who are growing food with a real deep concern for all systems, for ensuring that people are fed, for ensuring that we have healthy soil. What if we ensure that those farmers got the supports that they need? So I'd love to see that, and I think that we need to decentralize a lot of the farming here in the U.S. from rural areas and think about how can we create more infrastructure for urban agriculture. So a lot of thoughts.
Right, right. Right. I mean, a big part of sustainability is economic sustainability, right? So, whatever system we have has to be profitable enough, I guess, to be sustainable for the future. How does that affect your thinking about sustainability?
When you talked about economic sustainability, the first thing that comes to mind, Joe, is something that I'm often underscoring in my presentations and really encouraging people to understand that we can't just look at food issues in a vacuum. We know that lack of access to good food is simply one indicator of material deprivation in these communities. Most often, these communities also have crumbling infrastructure. They have underfunded, segregated public schools. They have very little green space for people to be active. There are very few jobs, and the jobs that are available oftentimes don't pay a living wage. And so we need to look at all the ways in which these historically marginalized communities have been impacted and thinking about addressing all those issues. We can have as many supermarkets and urban farms and all these types of resources for accessing healthy, fresh, and affordable and culturally appropriate food. But if people can't make a living wage to pay to take care of them families, if they can't have green space that they feel safe to be physically active in, if there aren't schools that are going to educate their children and prepare them for the 21st century, then what are we doing? So I always encourage people who are thinking about food to also keep one eye on these larger issues that are also connected to food insecurity.
Great. One of the things that I'm sure a lot of our listeners will pick up on what you said is you dropped a phrase in there several times that I think is very important and that I want to circle back to, which is culturally appropriate. So in a lot of conversations about local food and sustainable food, you don't necessarily hear people talk about the importance of culturally appropriate food. And I have a sense that you probably have a lot more to say about that. So I'm curious, I'm curious kind of what you mean by that and some examples of maybe ways in which food hasn't been so culturally appropriate, especially when it comes to this movement, the movement for sustainability.
Let's just think about the reality that so often when people talk about plant-based eating, vegetarian, vegan, there are these kind of stereotypes or ways in which people immediately go to, upper middle class suburbanites or, um, you know, hipsters living in gentrified urban centers. And these are typically the faces of white folks, right? And what that does is it erases the history. I mean, if we just want to talk about traditional diets, whether in West and Central Africa or throughout many parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, or different parts of Asia, or even traditional diets here in America, in the Americas, we know that many of these diets are largely vegetable based, right? Even if
Right.
meat was a part of the overall diet, oftentimes it was used for seasoning, to add flavor, to add a little fat. Um, when people had large quantities of meat, it's often on holidays and special occasions and celebrations. We know that before the industrialization of our food system, having meat at every single meal was cost prohibitive for most working class and working poor people. And so there's a precedent. Like we don't have to put fancy names on the diet, but there are ways in which people, the communities that I would argue have been most impacted by, our runaway food system, negatively impacted by runaway food system or food insecurity. These are communities that have these traditions of eating healthfully, whether you're talking about, African Americans, or we can look at Native Americans. So if we don't talk about these diets in the context of colonialism and an industrialized food system, then we're missing the larger point that pre-industrial food, pre-colonialism, these were largely healthful diets. And I think that's one of the reasons that when we're talking about, the criteria for an overall healthful diet, we hear a lot about nutrients and micronutrients, but I always argue we should talk about, well, what are the foods that our ancestors ate? What were our great grandparents and their parents eating? Because these are the foods that have sustained us for generations. And so when we talk about food, sustainability, plant-based eating, vegetable forward eating, however you want to talk about it, I think it's important that we highlight these traditions, that many other communities that are suffering from some of the highest rates of preventable diet-related illnesses like hypertension and heart disease and type 2 diabetes. Um, we highlight these traditions so that people feel like they can embrace something that is theirs, that's culturally relevant, and that actually moves them towards better overall health and well-being.
Well, let's talk about your book work a little bit, Bryant. You bring your own diet and culture and heritage together in the cookbooks that you've written, but you're taking a little bit of a turn in your career, and I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that a little bit. I believe you even referred to it as retiring from writing cookbooks. So I wanna hear more about that and let our audience hear more about that. What are you working on? You're finishing up a massive project now, whose title and cover is reflected in the chalk drawing behind you, I believe, right?
Yeah, Black Food is my forthcoming collection of stories, art, and recipes that I am curating and editing. And the book is actually going to be published by my new publishing imprint, which is called Four Color Books, which is a publishing imprint of Penguin Random House and 10 Speed Press. And so informally, throughout my writing career, I've always, made myself available to younger writers and done all I can to support them in, publishing work and getting it out to the world. So really, this imprint is just kind of a formalized way of me now having more resources and power to work with authors and creatives that I like and respect and ensure that their work can be seen widely as well. So we acquired our first book, and we're building the list from here. And I'm really excited about what we'll be bringing to the world in the coming years.
It's so exciting. Congratulations. When I first heard the news, as you know, I was ecstatic.
Thank you.
So what are you, when it comes to Black food, the book, what are you hoping to accomplish with the book?
As you know, so much of my work has been pushing back against a lot of the kind of reductive ways in which people think about, talk about, write about African American cuisine, largely reducing it to the antebellum survival foods that many enslaved Africans relied upon, or the kind of big flavored meats that you might find in soul food restaurants, the big flavored meats, the overcooked vegetables, and the sugary desserts. And I'm not denying that these aren't part of this larger, more complex and diverse cuisine. But what I argue is that so often what we don't talk about enough are the healthful origins of it. We talk about like the type of dark leafy greens like collards and mustards and turnips and kale and dandelions and sugar snap peas and pole beans and all these type of foods that I think any allopathic Western trained physician or dietitian or nutritionist would say that we should all be eating. And so, you know, you can't talk about African American cuisine without talking about the larger foodways of the global African diaspora, the food from West and Central Africa, from which many enslaved Africans came, to the Caribbean, to the American South. I mean, we need to talk about Native American foods, European food. So, I always argue that African American cuisine is the original modern global fusion cuisine. And, coming off the work that I do at the museum, thinking about the body of work that I've built as a cookbook author, all that really just coalesced beautifully with this new book project, which is largely inspired by my residency at MOAD. Literally, many of the chapters are literally taken from programming, and that's a chapter of the book. Black Women, Food, and Power, which was the first program that I had at the museum, which brought together some scholars and farmers and food justice activists to have a conversation about the historical and contemporary roles of Black women in the production and distribution and consumption of food and food knowledge. And so, all these things are my attempt to help us to see the connections between this larger global diasporic community. And just, the main thing for this book, Joe, for me is I wanted to move past just being mired in the problems. We know that we have a broken food system. We know that this broken food system has had such a negative impact on the health and the environment and the spirit of communities throughout this country. But the kind of guiding quote for me throughout putting this book together was Toni Morrison's charge. What do our lives look like without racism? When we don't have to be when Black folks aren't so consumed with the albatross of white supremacy and racism around our neck, what do our lives look like? We're, in touch with our agency and our magic and our brilliance. And that was what I explained to every single person who contributed to this book. So this book is about beauty. It's about joy. It's about our brilliance and agency. And it's one of those books that I hope seamlessly moves from, the kitchen where people are making recipes to their bedside where they're reading the stories at night, to their coffee table or their credenza so that they can look at the beautiful art and just really consume all the goodness in this book. So I can't wait for you to see it, and I can't wait for the world to have it.
Yeah, oh, ditto. I can't wait to see it. Oh, it sounds like it's going to be just beautiful. Well, since we're talking about beauty and joy and maybe the future a little bit, I wanted to ask you a little bit about kids. I know you're a father. I've recently started foster parenting, which has been really exciting and challenging. I may call you about that later. But I'm curious if you have thoughts about how important it is to engage kids in the goals of healthy eating and even sustainability.
20 years ago, I started my entree into food activism was working with young people when I started this organization in New York City called Be Healthy, Build Healthy Eating and Lifestyles to Help Youth. And so from the beginning, I've been very clear that if we want to have a successful food movement, we need to invest in young people. You know, when I think about many of the social movements throughout the 20th century, um, whether it's the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa or the civil rights movement here in the American South, it was young people, their bravery, their brilliance, their just ability to just be out in the streets fighting for what's right. That's what we need to invest in. And so, I think about that on a larger structural kind of approach, but I also think about it just on a personal level in my home with, my wife and me and the way that we raise our children, our daughters. And, there are a couple things that we've done to help invest in them cultivating a love for healthful eating and even being these kind of budding food activists. I think with parents who are hoping to, get their kids in the kitchen and getting them invested in eating healthfully or just eating good food, I think getting them involved in the kitchen, preparing and cooking food as early as possible is an approach that you should try. It was something we did with our oldest daughter when she was 3 years old and probably a little younger than that. We would, have her going to, the farmer's market with us, obviously shopping. And so she got a chance to meet the farmers and see the local producers who are actually growing the food that we're eating regularly. We have several raised bed gardens at our home where we're growing food. We had our daughter, as much as she could at such a young age, just being involved in the planting and the watering and the harvesting and the tending, all that stuff. But then in the kitchen, when she was 3, we literally started to get her involved in helping us prepare food. So we would harvest some food from the garden, and we'd set up her 3 little buckets. One would be with the say dark, the collard greens. The next one would be a bucket of water where she could clean them off. And then the third one would have a bucket and a colander where she could just let them sit. And as she started to, grow and her developmental capacities increased, then we got her more involved in the kitchen. And now as a 10-year-old, she's making full meals. Joe, she made her
Really?
birthday cake. She made a vegan chocolate cake with balsamic roasted strawberries and chocolate ganache. No help.
What? That is the dream. That's the dream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We see food as one of the primary tools to teach our girls about who they are, their history, their culture, the taste and, classic ingredients and, dishes. And so food is just everything. I mean, maybe that's just kind of, I'm stating the obvious here, but food is our life largely revolves around food here at the Terry Coon household.
Yep. Yep. Well, that's great. Well, Bryant, I want to thank you so much for this conversation. It's been delightful to connect with you and to hear about your work and to hear your thoughts on sustainability. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Been a pleasure.